Hi, I'm Mr. Loomis. Welcome back for this final lesson about the Cold War. We've learned a lot so far about the face-off between the United States and Soviet Union, and I'm happy to say that the story of the Cold War is going to end without ever turning into a hot war. All that preparation is just going to lead to nothing. Actually, that's not true. You see, in my opinion, the end of the Cold War is one of the most inspiring, hopeful, and happy stories from all of history. Before I tell you that story, let's preview today's topics. We'll begin in the 1970s with President Nixon's famous visit to China. Then we'll move into the 1980s and the story of President Reagan. He's a big part of today's lesson. We'll touch on his nickname for the Soviet Union, his ideas for keeping America safe from nuclear weapons, which did not include the Jedi Force, a scandal, and his work with Soviet leader Gorbachev. We'll describe how communism came to an end, beginning with the Solidarity movement in Poland and the Sinatra Doctrine, which is related to, but not really about the great singer Frank Sinatra. And finally, we'll learn about how communism ended or disappeared in the Soviet Union, China, and the rest of the world. Let's get started with China. When the communists took control in China in 1949, they created the People's Republic of China, PRC. And people who didn't want to live in communist China moved to the island of Taiwan. The United States said that the new free country, the Republic of China, or ROC, on Taiwan, was the real government of all of China. The ROC held the Chinese seat at the UN Security Council. But when he became president, Richard Nixon decided that it was time to have a better relationship with the communist government in the mainland. In 1973, Nixon surprised the world by saying that he would visit the PRC. Most people would have said that the president was soft on communism by visiting mainland China. But Nixon was different. As a past member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, Nixon's history as a fighter against communism gave him the cover he needed to make a change in America's policy toward China. His week-long visit in February 1972 allowed the American people to see pictures of China for the first time in over 20 years. Nixon and his advisors had important talks with the PRC leaders, including Premier Zhou Enlai and Chairman Mao Zedong. He and First Lady Pat Nixon visited the Great Wall of China, Hangzhou, and Shanghai. Mrs. Nixon also visited schools, factories, and hospitals. Nixon didn't visit communist mainland China because he had decided communism was okay. He went to China to help the United States get the upper hand in our relationship with the Soviet Union. The Soviets in Moscow and the communists in China often didn't get along and had even fought a small war over their border. By normalizing the relationship between the Chinese, Nixon got the two communist powers to compete against each other. Nixon's visit to China was the first time an American president had visited the People's Republic of China, and it ended a 25-year break in the relationship between the two countries. It was the key step in normalizing the relationship between the United States and Communist China. At the end of his trip, American and Chinese leaders wrote the Shanghai Communique, a report of the new relationship. In the communique, both countries agreed to work to fully normalize their relationship with each other. They would open embassies in each other's capital cities. Kissinger also said that American soldiers would leave the island of Taiwan. By recognizing the government of mainland China, Nixon set off a change in the balance of power in the world. The PRC took over China's seat at the UN Security Council. The United States moved its embassy from Taipei in Taiwan to Beijing. However, this did not end American support for Taiwan. The government of the Republic of China is still an important friend of the United States in Asia. America holds military training together with Taiwan and sells weapons to the Republic of China. Of course, the communist PRC does not like this. The United States still says it has a one China policy, meaning that we believe that the PRC and ROC should be one country with one government. But the United States still promises to stop communists from taking over Taiwan. So for now, there are two Chinas. Kissinger and Nixon also wanted to get help to stop the Vietnam War. They hoped that by working with both the Soviet Union and China, the two communist countries that supported Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, the United States would get him to make a deal to end the war. Because they were willing to have meetings with Nixon, the Soviets and Chinese showed that their one-on-one relationship with the United States was more important than their support for Vietnam. The relationship between China and the United States is now one of the most important two-way relationships in the world. Every president but one since Nixon has visited China. Nixon's trip is still remembered to be one of the most important, if not the most important, visit by a president anywhere. A Nixon in China moment has now become a way to say that a trip by a government leader was not expected, or was very unusual, or was especially important. The United States and China wanted to show the world that they were going to have a different, more friendly relationship. One of the best ways to do this was to have friendly competitions. Ping pong matches between Chinese and Americans showed that the people of the two countries could be both patriotic and competitive in ways that were not dangerous. Also, China gave a gift of 2 pandas to the National Zoo in Washington, D.C. Ling Ling and Sing Sing were the first giant pandas to live in the United States and were beloved symbols of friendship. Nixon did most of his work with China and détente in the 1970s. In the 1980s, another Republican president, Ronald Reagan, took over, and things were very different. Ronald Reagan was already well known when he was elected president in 1980. He'd been a movie star. He tried to get rid of communists in Hollywood during the Red Scare in the 1950s, and he'd been governor of California. Unlike Nixon and Kissinger, Reagan did not believe that getting along with the Soviet Union was possible. He did not trust communists, and he did not believe that letting the Cold War go on was a good idea. The Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan made him angry, so he ordered a huge increase of America's military. And he started dealing with the Soviet Union in new ways. In the 1970s, the government had been working on a new nuclear bomber called the B-1, but had stopped because it cost so much. Reagan restarted the B-1 program. He also began building MIRV missiles, which each had many nuclear bombs that could be aimed at different places. Finally, Reagan wanted to build a system that could shoot down Soviet missiles coming toward the United States. Reagan's problem with the Soviet Union was more than just about military power. Together with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of the United Kingdom, Reagan disagreed with communism and the way communist countries were run. In a famous speech in 1982, he said, "The forward march of freedom and democracy will leave Marxist-Leninism on the ash heap of history." And in 1983, he called the Soviet Union an evil empire. Nixon and Kissinger had wanted to keep the Soviet Union in check and find ways for the superpowers to share the world. But Reagan did not like this idea. Under a policy that became known as the Reagan Doctrine, he pushed back against the communists everywhere in the world. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, Reagan gave money and support to people fighting against communists. Sometimes this meant helping terrible leaders who did not support freedom, just to keep them safe from the Soviets. Reagan also sent the CIA to Afghanistan and Pakistan. They gave weapons to the Mujahideen soldiers, trained them, and led them against the Soviet army. Many people think that American help for the Mujahideen was one reason the Soviets lost in Afghanistan. Unfortunately, some of those American weapons were later used against American soldiers during the war in Afghanistan in the 2000s. In 1983, to protect the United States from attack, Reagan introduced the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, a program that would use ground and space-based systems to shoot down nuclear missiles coming towards the US. He thought this kind of security would make nuclear war impossible. Many people did not believe that this could ever work, and they called the project Star Wars, after the Star Wars movies that had just come out in theaters around that time. The Soviet Union did not like SDI. If the Americans could stop Soviet missiles, the Soviet Union would not be able to threaten the United States. In other words, the balance between the two countries that had made mutually assured destruction work would be broken, and the United States would have the upper hand. In fact, making SDI work was really hard, and it didn't happen during the Cold War. In fact, the US Missile Defense Agency is still trying to make a small missile that can shoot down nuclear missiles coming towards the United States. Americans supported Reagan in his way of fighting the Cold War. In 1984, he won re-election as president for 4 more years. More people voted for him than any other president in American history. But his work to fight communism also almost brought down his administration during his second 4 years in office. It was called the Iran-Contra scandal. President Reagan liked a group of anti-communists in Central America called the Contras. Congress had passed a law saying that he could not give money to this group because of some of the bad things they were doing to the poor. So some of the top people working for Reagan sold weapons to Iran in the Middle East and used the money to give to the Contras without Congress finding out. Reagan didn't know about the sale. When the newspapers learned about the deal, many Americans were angry. Iran was not a good friend to the United States, and making this secret deal was illegal. In all, 14 people went to jail for breaking the law. Because he'd been their boss, President Reagan told the American people that the Iran-Contra scandal was his fault. Even if people didn't blame Reagan, it looked bad that he didn't know what was going on in his own office. Because of the scandal, the American people had a better idea of what their leaders were doing to fight communism in the Third World, and they started to wonder if being involved in the proxy wars was really a good idea or not. Reagan's new, more aggressive way of dealing with communism did not last forever. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev, a young, popular leader, took over in the Soviet Union. Reagan saw an opportunity to do things differently, and he began to change his way of thinking and talking about the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's large military, their state-owned farms, and their way of making things really hurt the Soviet economy. At the same time, Saudi Arabia started producing more oil. The cost of oil fell to 1/3 of what it had been. Selling oil was how the Soviet Union made 60% of its money, so this really hurt them. The economy of the Soviet Union was close to falling apart. To fix things, Gorbachev put out a plan he called perestroika, which is restructuring, and glasnost, is openness. He needed money to make these changes, but trying to build enough missiles, ships, and airplanes to keep up with Reagan cost a lot of money. Gorbachev wanted to use that money to fix his economy instead, so he offered to make deals with the United States to get rid of nuclear weapons. Many of the people told Reagan that Gorbachev was probably not serious, but Reagan wanted to give Gorbachev a chance to make changes in the Soviet Union. Reagan thought that if he could get the Soviets to look at how well the American economy was working, they too would want to have a free market capitalist economy. Reagan and Gorbachev met together 5 times. The most famous meeting was in Reykjavik, Iceland in 1985 to discuss a nuclear missile deal. They agreed that they wanted to see a world without any nuclear weapons, and they promised that they would get rid of all their nuclear bombs. But their aides quickly said that such a move would not get the okay from other leaders in their governments, so they settled for a much smaller agreement. There were big differences between the Soviet Union and the United States, but Reagan and Gorbachev got along well, and the world leaders still look at Reagan and Gorbachev as examples of how to work together. Even though he stopped spending so much on the military, Reagan still wanted the United States to be a leader of the free world. He believed that it was part of his job to speak out against the evils of communism. Against the advice of his aides, Reagan decided to visit Berlin and to speak in front of the Berlin Wall. Like President Kennedy years before, Reagan was very clear that America would keep West Berlin free, and he called on Gorbachev to let the people of Eastern Europe travel to the West. And what had become one of the most well-remembered lines of the Cold War, he said at the end of his speech, "General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." We've talked a lot so far about leaders, Nixon, Gorbachev, Reagan, but this is not just a story of great man history. In fact, one reason I like the story of the end of the Cold War so much is because of the regular people, like you and me, who are so important. Let me explain. The first clear signs that the people of the communist world were tired of living with their failed system was the Solidarity movement in Poland. Started in 1980 by workers in the shipyards, Solidarity was a labor union. Solidarity was a challenge to communist governments that thought all the workers should be part of one great union run by the government. For workers, this kind of union did nothing to protect them from the government leaders. Led by Lech Walesa, the shipbuilders went on strike. Poland's government fought back against Solidarity, but the workers held together. At the end, the government agreed to let the workers have their own union. By 1982, 1/3 of all the workers in Poland had joined Solidarity. Walesa was seen as a hero by the people of Poland and in the West. In 1983, he was given the Nobel Peace Prize for what he had done. Walesa could not have done all that he did if people did not see that he was right and were not willing to help Solidarity get started. One very important person who supported Walesa was Pope John Paul II. John Paul II was from Poland. He thought that religious leaders were supposed to protect suffering people. As leader of the Catholic Church, John Paul II wanted to help make changes in the world, to make it a better place to live, and he cared a lot about the people who had to live in communist countries. He spoke out in favor of freedom and democracy. Because of his position as the leader of all Catholics, his voice against communism was heard around the world, and he inspired many people, especially American Catholics, to give money to support Solidarity. Because he was a religious leader and not the president of a country, the Pope could show himself to be a voice of reason, not tied to one side or the other. In Poland, Solidarity had done very well because it was of good leaders and international support. But what was most important was that Gorbachev had decided to keep the Soviet Union out of Poland's fight with Solidarity. For many years, the Soviet government had believed in an idea called the Brezhnev Doctrine. This was the policy or idea that the Soviet army should be used to support communist governments whenever they were in trouble. This is why Soviet soldiers stopped the revolution in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. But by the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was not doing well. The economy and the invasion of Afghanistan were not doing well. This made it harder for the Soviet leaders to tell the Eastern European countries what to do. So Gorbachev got rid of the Brezhnev Doctrine. In 1989, Gorbachev's foreign minister, Edward Shevardnadze, said that it was okay with the Soviet Union if all the countries of Eastern Europe, including the Warsaw Pact countries, wanted to change their governments. One Soviet leader said, "We now have the Frank Sinatra Doctrine." Frank Sinatra was a famous American singer who had done a song, "I Did It My Way." What the Soviet leaders meant was that every country could do things their own way, and no Soviet tanks or soldiers would be sent to stop them. Since 1945, the Soviet Union had kept total control over Eastern Europe. Now, Gorbachev was ready to let them just walk away from communism. In fact, the people of Eastern Europe were already getting more freedom. A month before they came up with the name Sinatra Doctrine, Poland had chosen its first government that was not communist. The government of Hungary had opened its border with Austria to let people cross the Iron Curtain and visit the West. Hungary was one of the few countries that the people of East Germany could visit, and thousands of them went there to escape across the border. Even though this upset the East German government, Hungary refused to stop the East Germans from using their country as a way to escape. The Sinatra Doctrine and changes in Eastern Europe really upset people like Erich Honecker, who really thought that communism was right. Honecker was the leader of East Germany. He begged Gorbachev to force Hungary to close its border, but Honecker had a growing problem of his own. Huge protests against East Germany's government were starting up in Leipzig and other East German cities. At first, the people in East Germany who met to protest were those who wanted to leave and move to the West. They shouted, "Wir wollen raus," we want out. Then, more people came who wanted to change the East German government, and the protesters began to chant, "Wir bleiben hier," we're staying here. The protests grew much larger, and by the fall of 1989, 500,000 people met at the Alexanderplatz, East Berlin's large public square, to demand a change of government. With so many people against him, and no help from the Soviet Union, Honecker gave up and quit his job. He had once said that the Berlin Wall would stand for 50 to 100 more years, but things were changing fast. To try to calm the protesters, the new East German government decided to let people leave the country, including opening the Berlin Wall that had separated East and West Berlin. But things started to happen faster than the government expected. When a reporter asked one of the government leaders when the new rules would take effect, he said, "As far as I know, it takes effect immediately, without delay." This was the top story on West German television that night. Of course, this meant that the news was heard all over East Germany as well. News broadcaster Hans-Joachim Friedrichs happily reported, "This 9 November is a historic day. The GDR, or East Germany, has announced that starting immediately, its borders are open to everyone. The gates in the wall stand open wide." East Germans started to go to the 6 checkpoints between East and West Berlin, demanding that the border guards open the gates. A small number of soldiers had no way to hold back the huge number of East Germans. Finally, at 10:45 at night, the leader of the border guards at one checkpoint gave the order to the guards to open the gate and allow people through to West Berlin. As the East Germans rushed through the gate, they were met by a crowd of excited West Berliners who were waiting with flowers and champagne. Pretty soon a group of people from West Berlin jumped on top of the wall and were joined by East Germans. They danced together to celebrate their new freedom. That night, television showed the people of Berlin tearing down parts of the wall. The East German government announced the new opening of 10 new border crossings, and large groups of people gathered on both sides of the Berlin Wall, waiting for hours to cheer the bulldozers that started to knock it down. It was an exciting moment for freedom-loving people all over the world as the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain it represented fell. The division of Europe into East and West had not ended in war, as so many people had feared. Instead, it ended as regular Berliners who had suffered so much danced and sang and tore down the wall that had divided them. On Christmas Day, 1989, American conductor Leonard Bernstein led a symphony of East and West German, British, French, American, and Soviet musicians in a concert in Berlin. He ended the performance with the Ninth Symphony, written by the great German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. The final movement, Ode to Joy, he had the chorus sing Freiheit, or freedom, instead of Freude, joy. In June 1990, East Germany began taking down what was left of the wall. By the end of the summer, almost every road that was cut by the Berlin Wall was connected and opened again. Today, little is left of the wall except a bad memory. The fall of the wall was a first step in fixing the Cold War divisions of Germany. Just 339 days after the Berlin Wall fell, on October 3, 1990, East and West Germany reunited as a non-communist nation with elected leaders. The changes in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe got people in communist China to start thinking about changes in their own country. In 1989, students across China got together and began calling for freedom of speech, assembly, and the press. Chinese leaders could not agree on what to do. Some wanted to meet with the students to talk about making change. Others saw the protesters as a dangerous first step towards civil war and thought that the protests should be stopped. Soon, the protests spread to 400 cities, and it looked like communist control of China might end like the communist control of Eastern Europe. But things didn't turn out that way. China's top leader, Deng Xiaoping, decided to use the army to stop the protests and protect the power of the communist leaders. He sent 300,000 soldiers to Beijing, where 1 million student protesters had gathered at Tiananmen Square in the heart of the capital city. Students had put up a 33-foot-tall statue named the Goddess of Democracy. It was built in only 4 days out of foam, paper, and metal, and looked a lot like the Statue of Liberty. The students had made it as large as possible to make taking it down harder for the government to do. On June 3rd, the communist leaders had had enough, and they sent in the army. Known in China as the June 4th incident, the army was met by students who had blocked the roads with burning buses. was in what most of the world now calls the Tiananmen Square massacre. Soldiers opened fire with tanks and guns and killed hundreds of students. By June 5th, the massacre was over. Tiananmen Square was empty, and the goddess of democracy had been knocked over and ground to dust by tanks. The whole thing had been shown live by Western television crews. Photographer Jeff Whittier took a picture that everyone remembers of a man, all alone, standing up to a column of tanks coming at him in the middle of Chang'an Avenue. All over the world, people condemned the Chinese government for using force against the protesters. Western countries put sanctions on China and stopped selling weapons. The communist government arrested hundreds of protesters and people who had helped them. They stopped other protests around China, sent foreign news reporters home, took over control of what was reported in the news inside of China. They built up the police and secret police and got rid of government leaders that they thought agreed with the protesters. The communist government also set limits on what people can say about politics. The new rules are still in effect in China. Talk about the Tiananmen Square massacre is not allowed, and school books have almost no information about it. After the protests, the government got rid of anything having to do with the massacre. They closely watch everything on the internet having to do with June 4th or Tiananmen Square, and block most websites that say anything about what happened. While the Chinese government allows some freedom of speech online, freedom of assembly is very limited. Since 1989, there have been no major public protests. The massacre has not been forgotten outside of China. Since it was destroyed, many models of the goddess of democracy have been put up around the world, including in Hong Kong and Washington, D.C. Unlike in China, Gorbachev wanted people to have more freedom to say and write what they thought. He wanted people to get to vote for their leaders. This is what his new ideas of glasnost and perestroika were all about. Gorbachev thought that giving people more freedom would save the communist economic system, but instead his plans led to the downfall of the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet Union was different from the United States in many ways. One was that the Soviet Union was mostly one large republic, Russia, and all the other republics that made up the USSR were much smaller. For all of its history, Russia had dominated the other republics inside the Soviet Union. As things were changing at the end of the 1980s, that would happen again. Boris Yeltsin, the new leader of Russia, decided that Gorbachev was moving too slowly in making changes. Yeltsin and many other people thought that Gorbachev should give up on communism and move to a free market economy, even if that meant the breakup of the Soviet Union. But not everyone wanted change. On August 19, 1991, Gorbachev's vice president, prime minister, defense minister, and the head of the KGB put Gorbachev under house arrest and formed a general committee on the state emergency. The organizers of this coup thought that many people didn't like the changes Gorbachev had been making and would support them. Instead, they found out that most of the people in the Soviet Union were against them. Russian President Boris Yeltsin went on television and said he was against the coup. Thousands of people from Moscow came out to guard the government buildings where Yeltsin worked. The organizers of the coup tried, but were not able to arrest Yeltsin. Even the soldiers sent by the coup leaders to find and arrest Yeltsin decided to support him instead. Also, the coup leaders could not block news broadcasts from around the world, so many Russians watched everything take place live on CNN. Even Gorbachev was able to hear what was happening by listening to British radio news. After 3 days, the coup fell apart. No one supported them, not even the army. The coup leaders were arrested, and Gorbachev returned as president. But the coup marked the end of his power. 3 days later, he quit as leader of the Communist Party. Without communism holding the country together, the Soviet Union quickly fell apart. Between August and December, 10 republics declared their independence from the Soviet Union. In a speech on television early in the morning of December 25, 1991, Gorbachev stepped down as president of the Soviet Union. He said that the office of president no longer existed, and all of its power, including control of the Soviet nuclear weapons, was given to Russian President Boris Yeltsin. That night, Gorbachev left the Kremlin. The Soviet flag was taken down for the last time, and the Russian tricolor flag was raised in its place. And this was the end of the Soviet Union. That same day, the President of the United States, George H.W. Bush, spoke briefly on television, saying that the United States recognized that the 11 former Soviet republics were now free countries. The next day, Yeltsin moved into Gorbachev's old office. After the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia went through a huge change. It moved from an economy planned by the government to a free market economy connected to the rest of the world. But the transition did not go well. Under communism, all the factories, farms, and other companies had been owned by the government. After the fall of communism, these were given to people who were friends with the top people in the new government. This left control of Russia's wealth in the hands of a very, very few, very rich men. The economy fell more than 40% by 1999. The banking system fell apart, and people lost all their money. It was hard for the government to collect taxes, and Russia had to borrow money to pay its bills. Many Russians started to wish for the old communist days, when things were bad, but at least they were predictable. Today, Russia has a free market economy, but control of the country's wealth is still in the hands of a few of the world's richest men. The Russian government, like many of the governments of the former Soviet republics, looks much more like the dictatorships of the Cold War than the democratic countries of the West. So, after an experiment of about 70 years, communism failed. It really did end up on the ash heap of history, as President Reagan said it would. And after all the money spent on the arms race, and all the lives lost in the proxy wars of the Third World, and all of the showing off the two sides did, Cold War came to a peaceful end. There were a few other communist countries in the world we should mention before we finish. Vietnam's leaders followed the example of China. They opened up the country's economy, creating a strong free market system, while keeping control of the government. There are no elections in Vietnam, but the United States and Vietnam have a good relationship today. Cuba's leaders have tried to hold on to communism. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union gave Cuba money to help keep its communist economy going. When the Soviet Union fell apart, Cuba lost its only friend, and the Cuban economy fell apart. With poverty growing all of the time, the Cuban government is beginning to let some private businesses start up. Castro is gone, but the new leaders don't seem to want to give up political power anytime soon. Only North Korea is left as a Cold War-like enemy of the United States. Now run by the third generation of the Kim family, North Korea has developed nuclear weapons, so it's unlikely that anyone will ever attack them. The economy, still based on communism, has totally failed. Without getting rice from other countries, millions of people would die of starvation. Today, North Korea is one of the poorest countries in the world, while on the other side of the DMZ, South Korea is one of the most successful countries. Without a doubt, the two Koreas show that Reagan was right. Democracy and a free market system are the way to financial success. The Cold War ended more than 20 years ago, but its legacy continues to be very important still today. The Cold War made the United States the leader of the free world. As the protector of freedom, America sent large numbers of soldiers around the world to protect our allies. In most places, the United States still has bases and soldiers. Both the United States and the Soviet Union spent lots of money to pay for the Cold War, and millions of people died in proxy wars around the world. Even though most of the proxy wars ended along with the Cold War, the fall of the Iron Curtain and the Soviet Union did not bring peace to the world. The fall of communism in Yugoslavia led to war in the 1990s as different groups of people started fighting for control of land and power. In the 2000s, Russia, Georgia, and Ukraine, three former members of the Soviet Union, have gone to war over land. In Eastern Europe, the end of the Cold War led to new economic growth in many more democratic countries. But in Afghanistan, the government was taken over by religious leaders after the Soviets left. They supported the terrorist group that attacked America on 9/11. Despite the end of the Cold War, military buildup and spending has continued, especially for nuclear missiles. Because there was no peace agreement ending the Cold War, the United States and Russia have kept and improved their nuclear missiles. And although countries that did not have nuclear weapons, and other countries that didn't have nuclear weapons before, like Pakistan, India, and North Korea, have now built and tested their own nuclear bombs. Bad feelings from the Cold War have been hard to let go of. Russia and America still don't trust each other. Russian leaders still think of NATO as Russia's enemy. As the former communist countries of Eastern Europe joined NATO, Russian leaders have felt more and more in danger. One reason Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022 was to try to stop it from joining NATO. While war between the United States and Russia is less likely now than during the Cold War, spying and cyber war are still very much alive today. And that brings us to the end, our study of the Cold War. Before we go, let's recap the big ideas from this final lesson. President Nixon decided to recognize the Communist government of China and visited Beijing in 1972. This led to an opening up of China. When Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, he decided to challenge Soviet or communist leaders. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire and built up the American military. He disagreed with the idea of détente. Reagan wanted to build a system that could shoot down incoming Soviet missiles. The plan was not technologically possible, but upset the Soviets because it could give the Americans an advantage in a nuclear war. Reagan also built more ships, planes, and nuclear weapons. Reagan met multiple times with Mikhail Gorbachev to try to reduce nuclear weapons. In the second half of his time as president, Reagan started to reduce nuclear weapons. He wanted to give Gorbachev a chance to start reforms inside the Soviet Union. Communism started to fall in Europe, beginning in Poland. Workers there formed a union that worked against the communist leaders. Pope John Paul II, originally from Poland, was an important voice around the world against communism. In 1989, students organized a mass protest at Tiananmen Square in Beijing, China. They wanted democracy and an end to communist rule. However, the Communist government of China sent in the army to end the protest. Growing protests in Eastern Europe turned out differently. The Soviet government under Gorbachev refused to stop the changes, and communist leaders in Eastern Europe opened up their borders with the West. In 1989, people in Berlin tore down the Berlin Wall. This most powerful symbol of the division between East and West fell peacefully, and the Soviets decided to let communism in East Germany end. Gorbachev had hoped that by allowing people the freedom to vote, he might save communism, but that plan failed. Gorbachev lost power in a failed coup, and the Soviet Union broke up. Russia and all of the new countries that had once made up the USSR gave up communism. Communist governments continued in Cuba and North Korea. In China and Vietnam, the communist leaders gave up communism as an economic system, but continued to rule without elections. Thank you very much for sticking with me all the way to the end. The world is a messy place, and even after the Cold War, there are still lots of bad people in the world. But I think that the story of the fall of communism can give us hope that regular people, like you and me, can work together to make extraordinary, positive changes in the world, and that our desire for freedom will always, someday, win out over the power of people who want to take our freedom away. I'll be back next time to talk about another inspiring story, the story of the civil rights movements. I'll see you then.